Folks. Thank you for joining us for, I think this is our third week of our candidate webinar series. While we give folks a minute or two to join us, I am going to quickly run through the format for anybody who hasn't joined us on these before. So we'll get started at about 12:03, 12:05. Our executive director for the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, Zach, will give a 20-minute presentation, followed by our guest today, Anthony Poor from the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, who we're very grateful to have with us. We will be doing Q&A in the chat. So as you have questions throughout the two presentations, you can put those in the chat and we will answer them in a Q&A session at the end, starting around 12:45. These presentations will be recorded and we're going to send around the two slide decks along with the recording this afternoon. So you can count on seeing those in your inbox to refer back to. And I think that's it from me. So Zach, I'll turn it over to you to run through the next couple webinars we have coming up and then get started.
All right, thank you, Casey. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate the folks that have kind of been coming to a number of these, and for anyone who's new, we're really happy to have you here. Just to kind of at the outset, this series we've been doing with a bunch of really incredible partner organizations is a nonpartisan series. We're all nonprofits, 501c3s. We don't participate in elections or anything, but we have a wide range of issue areas that we all work on and different expertise around a lot of the critical issues facing New Hampshire right now. And so we providing this webinar series primarily for candidates, but everyone is invited to learn and listen. And really the hope is to kind of get a taste of some of the work that we all work on, get to know us as organizations. We're not going to be able to give everything that we do in just 20 minutes, but we hope that we'll have contact information go out after the fact and really encourage people to reach out with questions, concerns, follow-up information. We really want people to lean on us and all the other organizations like the Center for Justice and Equity as in their roles as policymakers. So up here, you should see the rest of the schedule. Is that presenting?
Not yet.
All right.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. So, we've done 4 of these so far. They're all up on our website, the recordings and the slide decks. Today with the Center for Justice and Equity, Thursday is the only one of these that is at 10 a.m. instead of noon. So just flag that since it's a little off schedule with Housing Action New Hampshire, and then the last 2 next week. So with that, I'll jump in here. I'm gonna go at the beginning here. Gonna be some similar sides to previous ones, but we're gonna dig in a little bit more today into kind of the impacts of our school funding inequities on some of the different opportunities for students in different communities around the state. So real quick, for any of those that might not know, we're the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. We've been around for about 4 years. We are kind of have our roots in 40 plus years. And many members of our board doing advocacy as lawmakers, as nonpartisan policy professionals around school funding reform. We do a lot of information series like this candidate webinar series. In schools, at school board meetings around the state, really trying to help people understand the school funding dynamic in the state, the impact on them, their property taxes, their students, their communities, maybe their kids are students, and really showing people, a lot of layers of inequity to the system and where some of the levers of change exist, which largely is at the state level. So we do a little bit of we do some advocacy and engaging folks and helping them kind of become advocates. Because I like to say, I do this for a job. I care about this issue deeply, but I also only have my perspective. And so we really are always trying to make sure folks with different perspectives are able to engage with their lawmakers as well. So I'll kind of go through a quick comparison here. We'll build off this in the second half of the slide deck. So some of these might look a little similar to one we did 2 weeks ago, but I think it's helpful to ground in what do we mean by inequity, and what do we mean by that in the comparison of the experience of two schools, two public schools here in New Hampshire. And so here are some kind of commonly used metrics to use as outputs or kind of markers of success. And there's pros and cons to a lot of these metrics, but they are helpful. They are helpful in comparing different school districts. So here we have some very different proficiency scores for third graders for math and reading in public high school A versus B. We also have 20% difference in graduation rates. That's a pretty huge margin. And graduating high school is not the only marker of what a person can do in New Hampshire, young person can do, but for those in high school, it is a pretty big difference of 97 versus 78% graduation rates there. For those taking the AP tests, and we'll talk a little more about this later, but the AP tests are an optional test you can take to try to gain credit in college credit if that's what you plan to pursue a degree after high school. So for the students that make that decision, that are planning to go to high school, maybe want to get that credit, in the first high school, 86% of them are scoring a 3 or above, which generally is what you need for college credit, whereas another high school, only 40%. And so all those students that still make that decision, want that credit, only 40% are getting the necessary scores. We also see a pretty huge difference in teacher salaries. This is the average teacher salary. Averages are helpful. They don't tell the whole story. We'll talk a little bit more about starting teacher salaries later. But this is a $30,000 difference. New Hampshire is a small state. If you can travel 20, 30 miles and go through 10, 15 different school districts and have a wide range of salaries available. I mean, no one's getting rich off of $80,000 a year. If that's an average, you've been doing this for a while. People don't get go into teaching to become rich, but $30,000 is a significant difference in average salaries. And something I want to ask everyone, and this will kind of inform some of the slides later. Do we think that public high school B cares less about their teachers? Is this a challenge of that community just does not place a high priority on their public school system? They have other priorities, and they don't think that teachers deserve more, or they don't think that it's worth retaining teachers as they move along in their career and become a higher cost to the district. I would argue no, but we can get into that a little bit later. Median household income in these two communities is different, but double in high school, in the community public high school A is located versus public high school B. That's a pretty significant difference in the median household income there. And then this is the kind of flip side of that, the education property taxes. So in the first community, folks are paying, this is both state and local, $8.14 per thousand. It's not your full property tax bill, it's just the education pieces of it. Whereas that other community, they're paying 50% higher education taxes. And the result of that is, on a $350,000 home, pretty significant difference in the property tax bill, just for education property taxes. Municipal property taxes often are a significant bill in many communities as well. And so these are high schools in Hanover and Claremont. It's only 30 miles apart. And I come back to that question I asked a little bit earlier. Do we think that this is, and this is, I'm not just being facetious. This line of argument was literally put forward in an amicus brief to the Supreme Court last week or the week before in the Conval case, arguing that some of the reason there are differences in teacher salaries, course offerings, graduation rates, test scores, is because some communities just don't care about their public schools. And if people want better schools, they should just move to a district with a better school. And it's their fault for not moving. And that's kind of not really the state's problem. This was an actual serious face argument put forward to our New Hampshire Supreme Court that's deciding one of the big school funding cases right now. And so what they're effectively arguing is that Claremont just doesn't care about their students, their teachers, the impact of their school system as much as Hanover. And that's the only reason there are differences here, right? It's absurd, in our opinion, in my opinion. And I think what it really does not take into account is what are the fundamental underlying policy structures that create a Claremont having some of these statistics, despite the fact that 2 years ago, they voted, they overruled their school budget to increase their teacher salaries they added $1 million to increase their teacher salaries. That was a significant hit on their property taxes. Voters in Claremont said, we will pay more of our own taxes, which are already higher than many of our neighbors, because we value our teachers, we need to keep them, and we understand that to keep them, we need to increase their salaries, right? And so they are doing that. They are trying as hard, if not harder than other communities based on the economic circumstances they have and the lack of funding from the state. So lack of funding from the state, where does that come from? This is the total revenue for school districts in the last school year. It's about $3.8 billion. It's a lot of money. We spend a lot of money in public education. As a state, on average, around the state, in all of our communities, we prioritize, we care about, we understand the importance of a well-funded public education system, both for the students that are there, also for the wider community and for the state at large. Now, where that money comes from is where the real deep inequities start to show. 70% come from local property taxpayers. That's SWEPT plus local property taxes. I'm not going to get into SWEPT today. We did a kind of deep dive last week, but even though it's called a statewide education property tax, it is a local tax as it's currently administered. Only less than 20% comes from the state. It's the smallest share in the country of how much funding a state is putting into the public education system by a long shot. I'll just point this out because I saw an op-ed about it the other day. The lottery number there, the 4.9%. Sometimes people are confused why that's such a small portion of the total funding, given how much promotional materials done around the lottery saying that they're paying for schools. By law, all of the proceeds from lottery tickets, once you take out administration and winnings, right? The rest of it has to go to schools. So that's all it is, right? But it provides a lot less than some folks think. Now, another way to look at this is that 70% in local property taxes is a downshifted responsibility onto local property tax payers from the state. And that's, according to Claremont rulings from the 90s and subsequent Supreme Court rulings, which we'll dig into more next week. Now, how do we get to how much the state's actually providing? That 20%, like where does that come from and how do they justify it? And thinking through the inequitable access to opportunities for students, this is really important because this amount of money from the state then dictates how much local communities need to raise. And a community like Claremont has to bear a significantly higher burden because of their lower property tax base to make up that gap. So right now, the way we do our formula, every student gets $4,100. Students eligible for free and reduced price lunch, which is a marker of poverty. It's not actually to pay for meals. It's just because to be eligible, you have to be at or below a certain percentage of the federal poverty line. Students receiving special education services, those are students with disabilities who have been qualified for and approved for an IEP. They get an additional amount of funding. There's a recognition because those services cost additional dollars, and same for English language learners. About $6,000 on average. But the kicker is that is nowhere close what it actually costs to run our school districts around the state. Every district in the state looks like this graph. The green part is the amount of the actual per pupil expenditure, so just total school district budget, total number of students. helps us give kind of an apples to apples comparison. The yellow and blue combined make up the state's share, although the blue part is swept, so that's local property taxes. The state just takes credit for them. Again, I dug into that more last week, but even if you give the state credit for that, most places are 3 or 4 times the amount they get in adequacy funding is how much they're actually spending per student. So just the real world cost of providing, education in the state, which is on average very good public education, but that average hides some of these disparities. So jump back to this comparison with Hanover and Claremont. We're going to add a few elements to this. So this is some of the stats from the previous slides. Now let's look at how many AP classes were actually available. And Hanover had 31 offerings, right? Claremont only 4. So again, is a student in Claremont, are they just not trying very hard because they're not taking 6 AP classes? They literally don't have 6 available. What if there's no AP classes in the issue area that they want to pursue in college? Also, just the number of STEM classes available. There are minimum standards for schools in New Hampshire. Every school has to provide certain number of STEM classes, but you can add on to that if you have the staff and resources. And Hanover is a really excellent public school and adds on along a number of those. Again, kind of going back to, they have that funding available, and the way the system is structured right now, they're able to take advantage of that. For the students that want to go on to college, 62% are enrolled in post-secondary education, whereas only 42% in Claremont. Again, going on to college is not a marker of success. It is not better than other career or military pathways, but it is an interesting comparison, especially when combined with AP scores to show kind of like what actually is available for students, depending on what path they want to choose. And again, I'll come back to this. Look at the difference in the tax rates. Hanover is able to provide that with a significantly lower tax rate. And the goal here, my point here, is not to tear down Hanover, right? Sometimes we get, some feedback that it looks like we're kind of going after some of the wealthier districts or schools that are doing better, but it's to ask, like, what if and what about our system is keeping Claremont from having the same opportunities as Hanover? It's keeping Manchester from having the same opportunities as students in Hanover. That's what we should be aspiring to. Now, to dig in a little bit more specifically to some of these kind of disparate outcomes, disparate opportunities for students based on where they live and the general property value. We've done a number of reports over the year, and I pulled out some kind of the highlights from some of those reports. First one we looked at was advanced placement courses. So again, this is looking at those students that want to take these advanced placement classes. They're not required, they're offered, but they often require additional staff at the school district level. So for those students taking them, in general, high schools with equalized value per pupil, which is a measure of a community's relative property tax base, like how much money do they have behind each student that they can tax to raise money for their school. So it's a good measure of kind of like fiscal capacity of a community. Communities with higher property values, in general, higher AP scores. High schools with fewer students receiving free and reduced price lunch, remember that's a marker of poverty we use in New Hampshire. In general, the students with, schools with fewer students living in poverty, greater participation in AP courses. So you see kind of these correlations here of lower property values, higher number of students living in poverty, is lower number of students taking those exams and lower scores on those exams. We did another one just looking at students who decided to go to UNH, sorry, in-state, one of the in-state universities. The tuition rate of UNH is kind of an outlier in the sense of relative to other in-state enrollments or tuitions around the country. It's a little higher, but again, just a way to look into this system and understand some of the differences around the state. So 10 schools, the lowest equalized value per pupil, again, that kind of relative community fiscal capacity, their ability to raise money and the general property values there. Lower number of students applying, getting admitted to, and then enrolling at UNH than those communities with higher property values on average. Same thing for the number of students navigating poverty as measured by free and reduced price lunch. lower application rates and minutes and enrollment at UNH. And we also found that the percentage of students who were free and reduced lunch eligible had the greatest impact on the enrollment to UNH of the variables that we looked at. We also saw pretty big variations in SAT scores. So among the 79 high schools for which we had scores from, there's a pretty big difference. At that time, I think we were looking at 2019, 20, and 21, I believe. So kind of a 3-year average. The lowest average was Manchester West High School, and the highest Hanover. And also what we saw was, again, some of these trends where in general, where there's more students navigating poverty, there were lower scores. In general, where there's more districts that don't have that property tax base that lets them, right, provide the resources, even if they want to, like a community like Claremont, right, voting to raise their own budget by $1 million to pay their teachers more. That makes a difference, but they're swimming upstream, right? They already have really high tax rates, and they have a lot of folks that are struggling, can't afford to put more burden on themselves. And we see that kind of play out again and again and again in different metrics that we're looking at. A few more pieces coming back to that teacher salary. So this is a graph done by our friends over at Reaching Higher New Hampshire, did an excellent report 2 years ago on retaining and recruiting high quality teachers. And they found that communities with more property wealth tended to be able to pay teachers more, right? And again, that's not because those communities care more about their teachers. It's because they're operating in a system where they get so little funding from the state, right? That the property wealth of your community is kind of, are you able to have those conversations? Do we want to pay our teachers more? Where do we want to invest our local dollars? Those conversations become less and less and less and less of an opportunity when you don't have the property wealth to pull on. This is the wildest one to me for the teacher salaries to kind of hit home here. So also from that same report by Reaching Higher New Hampshire, what this shows is first year teachers with a bachelor's degree. So first year, so starting salary. So teachers who are, their very first year, they're trying to see which school district they're going to, maybe after they've finished all their certifications, they're brand new teacher, right? Lowest paying district made $19,000 less than those with the same exact education experience in the highest paying district. This starting teacher salary, $19,000 difference. And that pay gap just grew over time. So much so that it would take 18 years at the lowest paying school district for a step 1 teacher with a bachelor's degree to make an equivalent yearly salary as a step 1 teacher with a bachelor's degree at the highest paying teacher. So starting salary at the highest paying district, 18 years later, the lowest paying district would reach that starting salary on the same step scale, right? And that has reoccurring yearly generational impacts. In Newport High School, for example, loses 25 to 30% of their teachers each year because they just can't afford to pay them more. And that has really dramatic impacts on students, on the culture of the school, on the ability of teachers to kind of grow and stay there long term. Really, really dramatic impacts on the students overall there. I'm going to flip through these. I did this last week. I'm running up a little bit on time, but I just kind of want to end with a little summary here. We spent a lot of time talking about the funding system, money coming from the state, money coming from taxpayers, whose responsibility is it? And it's also really important to pause and make sure part of the conversation is the direct impacts on inequitable opportunities for students and where those impacts are felt the hardest. And what we've seen from study and study again that we've done, that our partners have done, is that you see the same trends play out where communities that have lower income on average, communities that have lower property value on average, don't have the funding in their schools and face the most challenging questions about where to spend their limited resources, and they just struggle to keep up. And it is absolutely not a lack of caring or a lack of priority, It's a system that, set them up to fail. And so as lawmakers, I really hope that you're, potential future lawmakers, you're open and interested in engaging and like looking at these systems of inequity and how to change how we fund schools to take into account the real life experiences of current school systems and see where we can kind of reallocate, change the way we do funding to make sure that all of our students, have opportunities, because we do have really good schools in New Hampshire on average. And how do we get those other districts the support they need? So with that, I will stop and kick it on over to Anthony.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to share my screen rather, if I could speak. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, great. So just bear with me for a second as this loads up, and here we're gonna be good. All right, so thank you all for joining me today. My name is Anthony Poor. I have the opportunity to join you not only with myself today, but also my colleague Joe Porter, the Chief Strategy Officer here at New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity. We've got a lot to share in a rather short amount of time, so we're going to be relatively quick, recognizing that Casey is going to be sending out our PowerPoint after the presentation. So if there's issues that you'd like to talk more deeply about, feel free to email us, and we'll go from there. So everybody can see the screen. I'm going to start from sharing the screen from the beginning. We're right there, which is great. We always start with this level setting exercise, which just really describes the difference between equality and equity. Now, we've taken this from the Robert Wood Johnson's Foundation's infographic space. We thought it really encapsulated much of what we talk about today. And we talk about the differences between what is equality and what is equity. Our choice is to give everybody what they need, understanding there's various circumstances and conditions that affect everybody's individual opportunities and choices. Here's our team. We're small but mighty. You see myself, Joe Porter, who's on the call today with me, our Chief Strategy Officer, Marie Toole, our Director of Finance and Administration, Mayor M.G. Benjamin, Mary Grace, who joined us originally as an intern and now transitioned to one of our part-time employees, and Ms. June Carey, managing our communications. From our board's perspective, I'll share some of this with you. We are a reflection of the communities in which we intend on serving. And I'm going to start from left to right, if I may, at the top. Dr. Jamal Downey, Catherine Kabbalah, Dwight Davis, Jason Bonilla, Troy Martin, Ignatius McClellan, Claire Holston, and Dr. Susan Heward. At the bottom of the screen are our three newest board members, which we're so glad to have brought in to the fold as of a couple weeks ago. Ramey Sylvester, McLean Middleton, Rabbi Robin Nafshi of Concord, New Hampshire, and Dr. Lori Langlos from the North Country, and actually Berlin to be exact. What you see here is a board of directors comprised of 11 individuals, 6 of them being women. We range in ages between the ages of 30 and 75. We cover all aspects of this state. North of the Notch, south of the Notch, Seacoast, Upper Valley, or any region in between. This is a reflection of a group of people who are both reflective and understand and appreciate the importance of structure and governance and innovation and risk and how to balance those. We exist for 3 reasons. For those of you who do not know this, we will celebrate our 2-year anniversary next month. We launched at Manchester Community College with 150 of our closest friends. And we exist for 3 reasons. First and foremost, if we don't understand our communities, we can't solve the real problems that we face. And as many of you may know, New Hampshire is an increasingly more complex and nuanced community. And if we're going to effectively manage and mitigate for these opportunities that present us, we need to understand our communities and their nuances. Second reason we exist is because our outcomes aren't the same in the state, whether it be economic, health, or educational outcomes, which we'll get to in a moment. And Zach spoke very well of today, particularly between our LMI communities and those who are a bit more affluent, if you will. And we believe in democracy, and that in order for our democracy to work, that we need to appreciate and understand each other's circumstance and have a different kind of conversation than we're having currently. Now, and give you a sense of our changing demographic profile, this is the latest census data. We've got about 1.4 million people in the state. 63% of our population reside in just those 3 counties, Hillsborough, Merrimack, and Rockingham. And 60% of the folks who live in New Hampshire are like myself, weren't born here. I moved here when I was 27. I'll celebrate my 54th, or celebrated rather, my 54th trip around the sun. Half of my life has been spent here. That being said, I want to give you a sense of where folks live in our land geography. If we look, Coos County represents 20% of our land mass and 2% of our state's population, to give you a sense of where folks are at and placement. Here, this is an older data set, not too late, from 2022. But our population in New Hampshire grew about 0.55%. So it was the second fastest growing state in New England. And this is entirely due to the in-migration of people into our state. Now, most people erroneously think that these are people coming into the state from other countries and so on. But the reality is the majority of people who choose to live, work, play, and pray here come here because this is a great place to do the following, what I just said, but more importantly, come from other New England states or other states here. They've chosen to live here. And I think we can all appreciate and understand why. Second of all, when we think about where this growth is really happening, it's really happening with our young people. Right now, our kids are leading the edge of our state's growing diversity. This is not dissimilar than what we see from across the country. I think my daughters represent what we see here. 1 out of 5 of our students under the age of 18 belong to a minority group, that largest being those representing 2 or more races. So my daughters, who are both 23 and 20, mother come from Colombia, and their father is a person of African descent. That is the fastest growing population, and why we have such an important focus on our young people and how we can ensure that they get what they need, so we, as they get older, can recognize all the opportunity that might be presented to the state. We share this graph purposefully because oftentimes, and we're here to respond to some of the misperceptions of our communities of color in New Hampshire, is that we only reside in our 3 northern tier towns, if you will. Like Black and brown people only reside in Manchester and Nashua or Concord or Portsmouth, when in fact we reside in all 10 of our counties, as you can see here. And if you did just a rough back of the envelope calculation, when you look at our BIPOC and our Latino populations across the state, we represent a little over 200,000 people, and that's a sizable population when we're only looking at 1.4 million people in the state. And now we're at a point in time as a community where we have relationships and resources, and now the institutional discretion to do what we think is best for our communities, and not be so much responsive, but also be proactive. You'll see a number on our website, a number of data briefs, which I'll talk to in a moment. We've done this because typically when we think about the number of languages that are spoken inside, for example, Manchester Central High School, one of 2 majority high schools here in the state, people talk about looking at this as an impediment. These are people coming into our community speaking the second language, and my goodness, all the expenses rated to ELO. I'm not suggesting that English language learners don't represent an additional expense, but you should know that 60 to 76% of the people who come into this state speaking a second language speak English very well. And so this is not a barrier to opportunity. In fact, it's an asset and a tool in our toolbox when you have a younger population who's bilingual. So again, we can meet the economic opportunities of tomorrow, and it's something that we'd like to hang out with. Now, if you look at this, and Zach talked a little bit about this, and we're going to talk about this, is that when you look at averages, New Hampshire's doing pretty well. We're an educated state, we're a fairly wealthy state, et cetera, et cetera. But when you began to peel back that onions and look at issues around race and poverty rates by identity group, as you can see, Latinos and Blacks are almost 2 times more susceptible to poverty, right, and living in a low and moderate income experience than, say, our non-Hispanic white and just our statewide average. Again, our outcomes aren't the same. I want to point this to, I think this is a particularly interesting thing, because of the issue that housing is it's on everybody's issue plate right now, regardless of any sector that you work in. If you look at the home ownership rates in 2020 for our Black population in New Hampshire, you see they were at 29%. Latinos were at 39% and others at 57% relative to our white counterparts at 73.5%. We're almost looking at a 40% swing. Now, as we think about our ability to close the racial wealth gap, home ownership is one of the principal reasons way in which you can do that. How can we close that racial wealth gap if we can't ensure that everybody has an opportunity to own their own home, right? Now, when you don't own your own home, things can happen. The other thing we want to bring forward too is this is another brief that you can find at our website, again, nhcje.org on our resources page. We recently began to look at our incarceration rates. A lot of this is to inform what we hear through our community building and organizing work. And so I want to cite this as an example. If you look at just our local county jail populations, I think this is particularly striking. When you look at our Black and brown populations in our county jails, they're 30%. But when you look at relative to our state population, it's only 6%. That's 400 times greater. Now we have to ask ourselves why this has happened. We can't ask ourselves why if we don't have access to the data. And frankly, trying to pull together this data, which is one of our findings, was incredibly difficult to do, right? And so if we're going to do this work, we need to do it through data-informed decision-making practices. And frankly, we need a lot more of that in the state. Second of all, or lastly, we oftentimes will share this slide because for those who are not experienced this kind of, hey, this is a living here in New Hampshire. And we call this slide affectionately, people don't think this stuff happens here, right? But it happens every single day, and we're seeing it more and more and more because of some people's fear of loss, right? As we continue to become a much more inclusive, equitable society where diversity is an output of these equitable, inclusive practices. Now, when we launched, as I said 2 years ago, we wanted to focus really on 3 things, and those are real solutions that reflect our realities and values, right? Second of all, we also understood that we're going to be much more productive as a state and frankly more successful when everyone can belong and everyone can contribute to the greater good. And at the end of the day, if we're going to do this work well, we need to do this by holding ourselves accountable to a different standard of conversations than we've been in the past. Now, our guiding principles, they're really 3, and they run through our institution. We want to focus on structure and policy level change. We can't address these deep inequities that have been long-standing, that have been in place because of certain policies and procedures through Band-Aid solutions. We need to think comprehensively about this work. This challenge affects all of us. And so with that being said, we need to work across sector, across regions, geography, regardless of pocketbook size, who you love, to do this work effectively well. And we also have to understand that real change takes time. And this is not going to turn around overnight. We need to practice the patience, the persistence, and the perseverance this kind of work requires. We can't lurch from crisis to crisis. We need to make long-term investment that show a much higher rate of return. And I think we often appreciate that. Our mission as an organization is to elevate and empower people of color in New Hampshire by fostering connections and changing systems and meeting community needs to make a better, greater state where all belong, right? Now, I want to talk about our values a little bit. Love, trust, empathy, inclusion, and accountability. The only one that's not there that I would humbly add would be humility, because the reality of the situation is we cannot do this work effectively by ourselves, period. And everyone has a part to play in making New Hampshire the best it can be. We organize our work across what we call 4 program pillars. That's community building and organizing, convening and connecting, that's our power. Our public policy work is around informing and educating, right? We want to disseminate information and develop solutions so everyone can benefit, right? And our policy solutions are as comprehensive and as well thought as they can be. We want to focus on building the institutions within our communities by strengthening and supporting them. And lastly, as an institution, we provide operating support and intentional investments. That usually will come in the form of, we're a fiscal agent for a number of smaller efforts across the state, which we think is a really important element of this work. We organize this work across our 6 sectors of effort: law enforcement, criminal justice, government, education, health, economic development, and civic engagement. These are what we complementary set of activities that we believe will actually be able to move the needle for our communities of color here in New Hampshire. Give you a sense of what some of this work looks like. Last year, we trained over 200 law enforcement professionals with implicit bias and de-escalation training. There's our trainer in the middle there, Scott Meters. This is cop to cop, 8 hours, face-to-face using video work. And again, we've done this across the state. The goal here is to be able to demonstrate our proof of concept we believe I've done through our data collection efforts. We've got buy-in from our chiefs. Now we want to institutionalize this work into state government. And by the way, this has been fully supported and provided, and all the financial support was provided by the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity. All of our law enforcement professionals get credit towards their 4 hours of de-escalation and implicit bias training that they're required to have every year, and everybody benefits from this. Another example, we also participate in the New Hampshire Judicial Branch's Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, and I'm a member, and we represent, the center is represented on the Juvenile Justice Reform Commission Subcommittee on Ethnic and Racial Disparities. What we see in the adult space takes place with our young people, and I think a perfect example to look at is who's afforded the opportunities for diversion and who is not, and how does a person's pocketbook size in some way dictate that outcome. As you know, many of us are involved in our educational efforts here, ensuring that everyone has access to a robust educational opportunity. And as you know, issues around the diverse, equitable, inclusive kinds of practices within our schools are have been under attack. And what we're trying to provide is good data to this work. What I want to spend a little bit of time real quick is, many of you may have known that on April 30th, we have released our policy platform. And for those elected officials and those who want to be elected officials, if you will, I encourage you to check out our policy platform. As you can see here, it defines the focus of our public policy work. It represents 2 years worth participatory research and community-based organizing work. We've organized this across our 6 sectors of effort, right? More importantly, we understand that the only way that we're going to be able to move forward on these 18 different policy recommendations is for us to collaborate and cooperate, and frankly, understand that we don't need to lead everything, and more importantly, it's important for us to offer support in these spaces. And so that's some of the work that we'll be doing. If you go online and you want to check it out, we've organized it in such a way where, for example, if you look at our civic engagement policy work here, you know, our policy reads, policy happens for people who participate. So NHCJE will focus on efforts to strengthen voting rights. You can see our policy priorities: automatic voter registration, no excuse mail-in ballot options, and making voting more accessible. You can see our rationale next to it and the supporting data. We are a data-driven institution. We want to use data to turn into actionable information that our legislators can use to inform their policy positions. We think this is very important work, and again, available for download. We also, for those of you who've taken the time to sign up for our bi-weekly or bi-monthly blog, this is an opportunity for us to share the good work of people across the state. When we originally launched this a couple of years ago, we did it first for just selfish reasons, to let people know that we existed here in the world. But second of all, we did it because we wanted to begin to put stakes in these policy spaces that we thought people should know more about. But more important, it's an opportunity for us to lift up the good works of others who are doing this work, that are oftentimes the unsung heroes that people should know about what they're doing. And to be able to create community in this work, because as you can understand and appreciate, it ain't that easy. Lastly, if you'd like to stay connected to our work, there's a few different ways you could do that. You could go to our website, nhcje.org. You could sign up for a bi-weekly newsletter. I guarantee you will not be sorry that you've done it. You could think about making your own racial equity action plan. You can look at some things right there. And also you can find us on social media, whether it be Instagram, LinkedIn, or so on. The one thing I didn't include on here that I also want to make sure I include for those that might have an interest, for those of you who'd like to connect with other organizations who are some way involved with helping to create a more inclusive, equitable society that's much more diverse, we just recently launched a directory on our website. So you can go on our website by, for example, sector. And let's say you want to identify organizations who are working in the health space, doing this kind of DEI related work across the state with the broadest of definitions. You can click on that and identify all the organizations who are doing that work and to be able to connect with them. Or let's say you want to say, hey, who's doing this really good work in Grafton County? You can click on it by county and identify organizations who are doing this work really well. We want to continue to provide and support the development of that connective tissue that allows organizations and individuals to communicate, coordinate, and ideally collaborate on projects of mutual benefit. With that being said, I think I was within time, maybe a little early. I know I spoke very, very quickly, but I wanted to ensure there was adequate time for questions and answers, both from Zach and from my colleague, Joe Porter, who's much smarter than I am. So I will quit sharing my screen, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Great, thank you, Anthony. Just a reminder to folks to put questions in the chat if you have them. We've got about 15 minutes here to do some Q&A. I've got one that I can start off with for both of you. And Anthony, if you'd like to answer first, since we just wrapped up with you, can you talk a little bit about what it looks like for legislators to effectively address the issues that you and Zach have both discussed? And do you have any policy priorities coming up for the 2025 legislative session at this point?
I do. And I don't mind answering that question, but I feel as if I've been talking a lot. I was going to open it up. Joe, my colleague, I'd like to give her an opportunity to introduce herself to the group and, if possible, re-ask that question so she can respond to it.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be happy to. Joe, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, that I can ask the question again after that.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. As my name shows, and as Anthony said, I'm Joe Porter, Chief Strategy Officer for the Center for Justice and Equity. And I don't know that you need to repeat the question, Casey. I think I got it. So as Anthony mentioned, we've outlined 18 policy areas. Much of those are very broad areas. And so exactly how, individual pieces of legislation impact those, we'll in a little bit wait and see. We know where we would like to make change. And so, we'll be following legislative efforts related to those things. Some of them are more specific than others. So, for example, if cannabis legislation refines itself to the legislature this session, we're certainly watching the expungement component of that. So there are places where I think we know exactly what we're looking for in legislation, and other places where we're watching carefully to see what gets proposed, and then we will do our assessments of where we think impacts could be, you know, both positive and negative on the communities we care about.
Well said, Harvey.
Fantastic. Zach, would you like to talk a little bit about what it looks like for legislators to address the school funding problem and anything that we've got our eyes on for the session coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'll start by echoing a sentiment that Anthony outlined too, which is school funding is not an issue we're going to solve next year. I mean, maybe we could, but you know, these are deep, complicated issues. I have some expertise in some of them, and I lack a lot of expertise in a lot of the areas around tax reform, how to best do the school funding initiatives. I've never been a teacher myself, so like that we are just one piece of this. And so just want to start by pointing out that part of how legislators can engage in this is to be really open-minded and come into this understanding that we both have really good schools and a lot of positive things going on average in New Hampshire, and there are deep inequities and communities and students that are really struggling for reasons well beyond their control and within the control of public policymakers to help alleviate. So I guess my ask would be to come into office really understanding that these are really challenging, big, large scale policy issues, but that coming into it with a creative mindset and really wanting to see how to make the biggest impact for the folks that need it the most, I think is the best way to kind of approach this work. A few kind of high level policies that we'll have our eye on are similar to bills that were filed last year, you know, legislation related to the two main school funding lawsuits. So the Conval and Rand lawsuit, there were a number of policies proposed last year around increasing base adequacy, increasing money for students with disabilities who have IEPs, you know, the special education funding, changing our tax structure, the statewide education property tax to make that more equitable. I imagine all of those to some variation will be refiled. So we'll definitely be watching kind of those buckets of work. And then also keeping our eye on the, you know, the school voucher program, the education freedom accounts, as that has been kind of expanding a lot recently and is pulling money out of the public education system. And so kind of like keeping an eye on the role that's playing as well. So I'd say those are kind of the big areas right now that we're anticipating there being a lot of work on. And then it's a budget year next year. So just kind of engaging in the conversations around the school funding formula and the budget.
And if I may, Russ, to answer your question, you asked a question, are your stats controlled for age? I think regarding the homeownership question, I think it was, or if I'm looking at this. So those are what that census is, that's US Census data that we were able to pull with the support of New Hampshire Housing. And so there's no, it's just aggregate, this is aggregate data. So what I will say is this, is that we are, matter of fact, I was just talking with our counterparts at New Hampshire Housing this afternoon, that we'll be advancing a much larger piece to kind of look at this particular issue around home ownership here in New Hampshire. As we connect that to our public policy work. If you look under our policy platform under economic development, our goal is to close in part the racial wealth gap. And one of the ways we can assist in doing that is ensuring that homeownership is a viable opportunity for anybody who chooses that. And so we'll continue to work with that. And frankly, obviously, there are organizations who are doing that work already. Our goal is to support and provide a focus on the communities in which we're working in support of. And so I hope that is helpful to you, Russ.
Thank you, Anthony. I have a question that was asked a little earlier on in the chat during Zach's presentation. Zach, could you provide a little clarity on who filed the amicus brief that you mentioned?
Oh, yes. That was amicus brief filed in the Conval lawsuit. So kind of on the state's side in the Conval lawsuit, the Supreme Court. It was filed, I had that up. It was filed by the American Institute for Economic Research, and the author is Jason Sorens. That name might sound familiar. He's the founder of the Free State Project in New Hampshire. I think it's on our website, folks are interested in reading it, but he has also testified at the legislature before and made similar arguments around effectively, if people cared more about their kids' education, then they would just move to a district that had a better school. I'm summarizing, oversimplifying, but that's the thrust of his argument, and really kind of distorting the layers of economic mobility and of public policy that make that less of an easy choice than he kind of makes it seem. But yeah, it was American Institute for Economic Research was the organization.
And Anthony, if I could just jump in on Russ's point in the chat,
Please.
which I think is appreciable. I think one of the things that we know is that new home ownership purchasing is the same discrepancy between white populations and not white populations. So your point about, older folks are more likely to have already purchased their house is certainly correct. But new home ownership rates are similarly discrepant between the two populations. And those are similarly aged folks who are trying to buy new homes. So I just wanted to indicate that you're absolutely right about that. But we do see that discrepancy even when we not necessarily age adjust, but we look at similar populations trying to get into the market.
Great. All right. Well, it looks like that's what we've got for questions. So we will end a little early here. Just a reminder, I will be sending the recording and slide decks out to folks this afternoon. Our next one of these webinars is this Thursday at 10 a.m., not the usual noon time, with Housing Action New Hampshire. And I just wanted to say thank you to Anthony and Joe for joining us on these. We really appreciate your participation and the valuable information that you were able to provide for folks today. So I will go ahead and turn it back over to you three if you'd like to say anything to leave folks with, and then we'll close this out.
Zach, please.
Oh, yeah, I continue to appreciate gratitude for partners like New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity for joining us for these, for folks showing up. And I know a number of folks have been watching the recordings after, and just really highlight, like, please reach out to us, right? Please use this as a starting point for learning some information about these issues that us and other organizations work on. And if you have questions, I mean, Anthony put up a bunch of good resources for the blog they have, the newsletter. Please make sure you're engaging with these organizations, and we are here to help provide information and provide perspective and feedback and expertise. So I just really encourage folks to stay in contact with all of us. If you're interested in filing legislation that you think one of our organizations might have some feedback on, let us know. We might be able to either give feedback or point you in the right direction if we're not the best organization to talk to. And the more we can kind of all collaborate on that, I think the better the legislative process is. So I'll leave it at that, and really appreciate folks being here.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, hey, we're your friends, we're your neighbors, we're your allies, and we're your partners. And so never, just to underscore what Zach has said, never hesitate to reach out to us if we can be helpful and be of service in any way. I think we all want the same things here, right? We want to live in the best community that we can. And that's what we all are kind of working towards. And so, Joe, you got anything to say, ma'am?
No, I just want to say thanks everybody for the time and the energy, and thanks in advance for the energy going forward. This is collective problem solving. And so we really look forward to working with folks in the future to make this the best New Hampshire for all.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a
Have
good
a great
afternoon,
day.
everyone.